I found that breathing techniques for me not only addressed those physical symptoms, but also I was able to concentrate on what I needed to do.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of 80% Mental, quite possibly the world's greatest podcast about sport and performance psychology. My name is Dr. Pete Olusoga, and I'm on a mission to try and unpack the mental aspects of sport and performance for your ears and brains to digest. We're a few episodes into Series 3 now, and I think it's gotten off to a pretty good start. In this series, I'm switching things up a little bit, and I'm trying to focus in on some specific areas of sport and performance. So far in this series, we've covered the psychology of endurance, speaking to Marathon des Sables athlete Greg Hewitt and sports psychologist Dr. Amy Whitehead. And in the last episode, I spoke to Newcastle Eagles head coach Mark Stutel and coaching psychology expert Dr. Kristen Diefenbach about the psychology of the coach. Make sure that you head on over to 80percentmental.com or follow the podcast on Twitter at EPM Podcast or on Instagram at 80percentmental for links to both of those episodes and everything from Series 1 and 2. But I'm going for something different again for this episode, in which I'm going to explore the psychology of dance. Now, I don't dance ever. Apart from, I suppose, the odd occasion when there's a lot of alcohol involved. Please drink responsibly. And I think if I had to say what my favorite dance was, it's probably the safety dance. So I think it's fair to say that I'm going to need some help with this episode. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome to the podcast two wonderful guests who are going to help me explore this intriguing topic. Well, first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Kit Holder, first soloist with the Birmingham Royal Ballet. Kit's performed as a professional ballet dancer for over 20 years now, touring throughout the UK and internationally. He's also choreographed professionally and has a master's degree in choreography. And in addition to his work in dance, he's now somewhat marvelously in the final year of a psychology undergraduate degree. Kit, first of all, welcome to 80% Mental.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'd love to know what inspired you to study psychology.
I came to realize quite slowly, quite relatively late in my dance career, that there was something else other than physical ability and the physiological side that appeared increasingly crucial to performance and sustaining performance. And over time, there were various examples of things that made me think, yeah, that's a psychological thing. And I just started delving deeper into that.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to unpack some of that during the podcast and get some of your thoughts. The perfect guest for this particular episode.
I hope so.
And joining you is Dr. Sanna Nordin Bates, professor in sports psychology at the Swedish School of Sport and Health Sciences, chartered psychologist with the BPS, and Sanna teaches performance psychology to athletes, coaches, dancers, and teachers. Sanna, welcome to 80% Mental.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here. You might want to record that one again, though, because it's associate professor.
Associate
I'm not full prof.
What did I say? Did I say professor?
Yeah.
Do you know what?
It's nice that you big me up, though.
No, I've done that before on this podcast. I've sort of given people honorary doctorates. Just sort of throw
just
them out.
Just wake it and see what you emerge with at the end.
You can have it, and in a few years' time, it might be true anyway. So
see how long you wait with publishing this podcast.
Yeah. So I just wonder before we start, if you could tell us a little bit about your line of research.
Sure. So I've been focused on perfectionism and various related things for the last decade or so. And that's sometimes perfectionism and creativity, so kind of nice things, and sometimes the other side of the coin in the sense of perfectionism as a predictor for disordered eating and other forms of ill health. Often use motivation theories to help understand what goes on and why. And I've just found that fascinating and very helpful in terms of understanding dance and dancers, but also quite practical tools really for helping teachers and dancers themselves. But I started researching dance straight away from the beginning of my PhD, because my then supervisor, Jennifer Cumming, had just done a study with KITS Ballet Company, in fact. So this is many moons ago, but an imagery study.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd applied to a PhD in sport and exercise imagery. And then on day one, she said, "Oh, we've just done this study with ballet dancers, and like the questionnaire from sport doesn't seem to work very well. Do you want to focus your PhD on dance instead?" And I was beyond excited, because I'd done so much dance and aesthetics growing up. So it just felt like a wonderful fit. And then, just carried on working with dancers and dance research ever since.
Oh, fantastic. Well, again, the perfect guest for this podcast, and I guess come full circle to be sat here working with Kit as well. So, well, we'll get straight into it then. So, Kit, I'd love to know what it was that first attracted you to dance. Is that something that you've always done, like from a young age?
As long as I remember. I'm the youngest of three boys in my family, and I think we're quite lucky in that my parents had always tried to encourage any interests that we had. And I think for my older brother, they were really keen that he got the opportunity to try a really wide range of things. And for some reason, dance stuck for him. My parents aren't dancers, and certainly at that point, they didn't know anything about dance at all, particularly classical ballet. But they encouraged that. They found the dance school, and we were also quite lucky living close to Birmingham that we had a really good quality ballet company that would tour to Birmingham, which at that point was Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet. Mm-hmm. So they would find ways to get tickets for those shows and to go. And I think by the time it came to me, it was as much anything just imitating and copying my older brothers, as much as it's easy childcare to take your kids to the same activities, which isn't to say that I wasn't encouraged to also look at other things. I played a little bit of rugby, a little bit of football, and I had music lessons and all the kind of usual things. But I think the influence of my brothers is really what stuck.
Yeah, and I was going to say, was it always ballet for you then, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, during the course of my vocational training, you cover, certainly I went to the Royal Ballet School and we covered quite a wide range of different types of dance there, which I have to say has been really, really useful in my career. Not all ballet schools necessarily cover those things. So we would do a lot of national dances. I did that. I loved Morris dancing. I thought that was the best thing. And we did some clog dancing and tap and contemporary dance and Spanish dance and Irish and Scottish and, a real wide range of things. But it was always, the predominant focus was very much ballet.
I wonder if you could tell me about the first time that you really performed, like the first time you kind of got up on stage. What was that? Can you even remember that?
Well, there's some evidence that I had one line in a church pantomime when I was very, very young, and I don't remember that at all. Yeah. So the first thing I remember was so the ballet company that toured to Birmingham, Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet, when I was 8 years old, moved to Birmingham permanently and set up home in the city. And that first year, they did a brand new production of The Nutcracker at Christmas. And there are a number of children involved in the first act. And I was fortunate enough to be one of those kids. And I absolutely loved it. It was great. The kind of opulence of this production, but we didn't have anything like that at home, and it was great being with other kids and then seeing these adults. And I don't think I necessarily felt that I was any different from them. It was just the skill level. 8 years old, I thought, these guys are only 10 years older. It's not that much. and I loved it. I loved the atmosphere. Everybody seemed like they were having so much fun. They were doing amazing things, but it didn't come across as work for them, at least from my perspective. And I just thought, great, that's what I'm going to do. And I stuck to it.
When did you make that sort of switch then from kind of enjoying it, just something to do, something that you got sort of fulfillment and enjoyment from, to it being like a job? Like, this is what I'm actually going to do now for my career.
There's an overlap, I think. I decided very early on, really genuinely at about 8 years old, that this is what I wanted to do, and it's never really wavered from that. I was encouraged, very sensibly by my parents to consider the fact that it's not really a guaranteed career. A lot of really good dance graduates never really get jobs, and particularly not the one that they want. So I was made, in no certain terms, very aware of that. And I did all the academic entrance exams for the good local schools and so on. But my mind was set. And that carried on. I was very, very fortunate that I got the job that I wanted. And I'm still, 22 years later, grateful for that. But the enjoyment over it, a sense of it being a job, has carried on well into my career. And there's probably quite a number of years before I ever had the sense that, oh, well, this is just my job and I've just got to do it. I think there must have been a point where I was really lacking in motivation or something. And then it was, oh, well, this is what I'm paid to do. And most of the time, I really love my job. So, okay, there's going to be times where I don't, but I've still got to do it. I'm still being paid to do it. And there's a respect maybe for your colleagues that you've got to turn up and do it, and a respect for the audience that you've got to do it. But I would say now that it's probably, if we were to try and match it up, it's probably aligning with the sort of physical decline that happens over those 20 years, that the instances where it's challenging and feels more like a struggle and a job have increased over that time.
Yeah. I sort of asked that question as if it's like completely impossible to enjoy your job. I didn't mean that. Of course it's possible to enjoy what your job is. So nice to hear that you've kind of continued with that, even though it's become
I still do.
Profession. Yeah.
I still really, really enjoy it, but I've had to embrace the challenges, the increasing challenges.
Yeah. And Sana, obviously your research and your work as a psychologist in dance, but I know you have something of a background in dance as well as a performer. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd stretch to performer after hearing Kate speak. I trained a lot of dance. I started in some kind of clap your hands and waddle in a circle at age 2.5. And, did ballet between 4 and 16, more or less, and now again since 1.5 years. And then many other styles alongside it, and probably 10 styles of dance sort of in total, but never with an intention to be a professional performer, and intertwined with lots of sport. I gave up dance to do aesthetic sport at a high level, so some similarities there clearly. But
okay. So what was that then? What was the sport that you did at a high level?
Equestrian vaulting was my main sport,
okay.
And then I stopped that, leaving Sweden, and trampolining and sports acrobatics, mostly. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. So again, you sort of mentioned some of the research, but can you tell us about some of the work that you've done as a psychologist, working with dancers? We're going to get to some of the mental aspects of dance in a while, but just kind of give us a brief overview of the sorts of things that you do.
Sure. So towards the end of my PhD, so that's something like 2005, I was asked to start teaching on this Masters in Dance Science that was then at the University of Wolverhampton. So that was an academic thing, but also that got me in touch with several people who were also working more applied, which also led to being recommended, I suppose, so being asked to do psychological consulting for English National Ballet, and ended up doing that for 4 years, maybe, something like that. And after a bit of that, also to Royal Ballet Opera School for 2 or 3 years. So those were roughly until I moved home to Sweden at the end of 2011. So, I mean, sometimes those are one-on-one conversations, as people might imagine that a psychological consulting would be, in a closed room and giving advice and so on. And sometimes it's much more group-based. So with the company, I would have like a discussion group that anyone could join and pop in and out as they as they wanted and as their schedules kind of allowed, like, oh, this week we're going to chat about perfectionism, and this week we're going to chat about coping with injury, and so on. And I would sort of throw in a few, they could be research results or kind of prompts or, bits and pieces that I'd learned from an academic world, and we would discuss those, and people would bring their experiences. And with the school, it would be some sort of proper academic classes, if you will, because the students were obviously doing qualifications in dance as well, and which required certain bits of dance health, and sometimes more impromptu kind of group sessions, and sometimes meet the teachers and, sort of do CPD for dance teachers and so on. So quite varied.
I'm here with Dr. Sanna Nordin-Bates, Associate Professor, depending on when you're listening to this, in sports psychology, and Kit Holder, first soloist with the Royal Ballet Birmingham. And we're talking about the psychology of dance. Now, Kit, you mentioned earlier on there's obviously a tremendous amount of physicality in what you do. You need to be strong and flexible and have stamina, and this podcast is about the mental aspects of performance. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of the mental challenges of performing as a dancer. And I'll sort of leave that as a really open question for you to go with where you want to.
Yeah, thanks. I think injury jumps out as an obvious thing. I've had, in my own experience, I've had 4 significant surgeries with various rehabilitation times, and the longest period that I had a kind of an unnoticed knee injury, if you like. I was struggling with it. We diagnosed it as a meniscal tear, and when I went in for surgery, they discovered quite a significant chondral defect in there, which was repaired, was microfractured, but I was unaware of that. I'd given permission. I said, look, I'm a dancer. I've been dancing for 10 years. If there's anything else that needs doing, I'd given all those permissions, go ahead and do it. And our clinical director was also there, so he would have presumably advised as well at that time. So when I came around after the anesthetic, I came to discover that my layoff was going to be significantly longer than I'd anticipated. I'd anticipated a couple of weeks, and we were then talking anything from 9 to 18 months.
Wow.
So there was a psychological challenge first in coming to terms with that, and then going, okay, so this injury was more severe than we realized. What are the implications of that? We're talking about recovery timelines, but also to what extent will I recover? And will I be back where I was before? Maybe I could be better than I was before. Maybe this thing was hampering me. So I was all of those things turning around in my head. But during that rehab period, I was put in touch with a psychologist, Britt Tudge at Foxhall, who, at the time, I thought, well, I'm kind of feeling good about this. I don't really see the need for a psychologist, that classic thing that there must be something wrong, and we had a great conversation, and it was more about educating me with strategies that I either might find useful just then, or that she recognized would be useful strategies for me to have in my locker going forwards. And that really pricked an interest for me. So there's that side of challenges that dancers will all experience at some point. Everybody gets injured, right?
I was going to say, I suppose it's a fairly common thing.
Yeah,
given
and
the work that you
it's
do.
great to hear that Sanna had spent some time working at the Royal Ballet School, because during my time, that didn't happen at all. I'm much older than that, but it didn't happen at all. And some of the things that I've come across in my own studies and reading, I really wish I could have been educated with that during my education. And it's been a bit of a frustration to me that some of those things I've had to discover through my own experience, when it would have been so easy. It's like an hour session 3 times a year could have put a lot of those things in place for me that I then would have had that in my arsenal for my career. The other challenges are things like it's a grueling profession, so motivation can be at times a challenge. I think it's been interesting for me over 2 decades to look at where the sources of my motivation have come from and how that's shifted over that time, and from kind of an external demand to an internal discipline almost. That's been really interesting, and of course it's fluctuated in either direction on any given day, but that certainly can be a challenge. And I spent a long time in the corps de ballet. That's the group, the chorus, the people that stand at the back and hold a spear. I was effectively employed as a corps de ballet dancer for 14 years, which is a long time. And I'm not going to pretend that I loved every second of that. I didn't. That's challenging. You're watching friends, colleagues, dancers that are much younger than you, taking the spotlight, doing amazing things, and your career's, kind of feeling like it's quite slow. That's definitely a challenge. So looking at where's my motivation to do this in those moments was occasionally challenging. I think the only other area for me that stands out where I've found, I'm looking at this from a perspective of now having, obviously compared to yourselves and some of your other listeners, nowhere near the expert knowledge, but an increasing knowledge about psychology. The area that I found something that's really benefited me is in terms of the kind of skill acquisition and learning side of things. I feel that I'm a relatively slow learner when it comes to learning choreography. Some people can watch something and then recreate it. Or we do a lot of learning from video, particularly as a kind of homework just to try and get ahead. And I find that really difficult. I'm very, very slow. My wife is also a dancer. She's one of our top dancers. She can watch a video and she knows the choreography. It would be difficult if we had to learn from a video at the same time. She'd be pretty frustrated with my pace, I think.
Yeah.
So I've found even things like visualization as a tool for, obviously not so much learning, but for solidifying that learning. And going back to what I was saying earlier, if I had been just given that information when I was in school, it's so easy to explain that process to somebody, but in my era it didn't happen, and it wouldn't have given me a career as a principal dancer, but I might have been a little bit quicker for sure.
Sana, you've been listening to Kit there describing some of the mental challenges. From your perspective as a psychologist, what do you think are some of the challenges? What regularly comes up with dancers that you work with, or some of the conversations that you have?
Yeah, so certainly I agree with all the things that Kit has said. I mean, injuries happen. We know the injury rate in high-level dancers is something like at least one injury for about 80% of dancers every year. So that's a lot. Not all of them severe with, months of rehab, of course, but nonetheless. Fear of re-injury is a big deal towards the latter stages of that and the sort of early stages of coming back. There is a reason I research perfectionism. I see that quite a bit in its various guises, from the dancers who are doing well with it at the time and have it as almost a source of pride, as like they wear it like a badge of honor. I'm a perfectionist, hence I have what it takes. Almost like that classic thing that people say in job interviews when they get asked, like, what are your main weaknesses? Like, it's a politically correct way of saying, look at me, I work hard, like I'm really driven. Through to the negative sides in terms of the self-critique, the never being satisfied, the never feeling good enough, and therefore not really letting themselves rest or even be pleased for a moment. Especially when it comes to ballet, less so perhaps with other styles. I see a lot of issues around low autonomy because of the traditional structure of how things are set up in classical ballet. There is a lot of top-down decisions that are not necessarily explained. Feel free to jump in, Kit, if you want to agree or disagree with those.
It's really great to hear you say it, because one of the things that interested me most really early on in my own studies, self-determination theory and the importance of autonomy within that. And I've been struggling since to look at how can we increase that sense of autonomy in our environment. I've really struggled with it. And I've spoken to various sports coaches as well. What does autonomy look like in your environment? And although people often struggle to answer that question immediately, I've had several follow-up replies on email saying, oh, well, we try to do this, and our athletes or our players can do this, and they can request this, and we talk to them about this planning. But I've yet to really get my finger on how we do that better in dance. So perhaps that's a conversation for Sanna and I another time.
Yeah, I mean, I can pick it up a little bit now in that sometimes it's autonomy in the moment, right? Like within the structure of an existing ballet class that perhaps can't be changed then and there. It can be as simple as giving options for how they want to finish the phrase, right? Or just listening in with the dancers of going, how are you feeling today? I know it was a really intense rehearsal yesterday. So should we focus on this or on that? That's giving autonomy just in the sense of allowing some individuality and like, look, I am here to gear your training around you rather than pushing you into the mold that I'd already kind of decided was happening today. In choreography, it's more obvious, of course. So I think the fact that things are changing in a lot of companies, parts of the world and so on, where there is a lot of co-creating with choreographers for the people who have those sorts of roles, admittedly, not everyone necessarily, but there is a lot of autonomy there. And then it's sometimes about equipping people with the tools and the confidence to embrace it. Because especially if you're brought up with very low autonomy for years and years and you're expected to do as you're told, essentially, then it can be really scary to suddenly be like asked to improvise in front of some famous choreographer who's showing up, right? So there it can almost be overwhelming. But some people, of course, love it, right? And take every chance to create and do the choreographic challenges at school or live it out in the contemporary class or whatever it is. But I mean, more from a structural point of view, they're different people, right? Who need to embrace and make those kind of structural changes, because a dancer can't change the structure of the company or the nature of the class. And sometimes not even the teacher feels able to do that, even though they're the ones who are kind of issuing the instructions. So I think it's at different levels. I think there's a lot to be done, but I think there is also change happening. It's slow, but I see so many people commenting on it who have that frustration that you express, who do tend to study in various ways, or who are absolutely dead set to be like, I'm not going to do this when it's my time to be a teacher or a leader of some sort. So I hold out hope. Yeah, and sometimes it's great with the sport contrasts. So an ex-student of mine, now a friend, who is an ultramarathon runner, when we were discussing this issue, at one point she was like, oh my God, they don't even make their own training schedule. They don't even choose their own coach. So sometimes just having those complete external views is really refreshing and kind of gives more of a zoomed out perspective on what might be possible or how things can also be done, rather than stick to how it's always been. But that's a really long answer.
No, we like really long answers, detailed answers. It's interesting because one of the classes that I teach on my course, we explore different high performance environments. One of the sports psychology classes. So we look at things like medicine, and we look at things like business, emergency first responders, and so on and so forth, as well, obviously, as high performance sport. There's kind of an image that we all have in our heads about ballet and about kind of the strict training, this ruthless, sort of really harsh environment, and sort of perpetuated by the media and the films that we see about it. But, listening to you speak then, I just wonder how much of that is actually accurate, because it seems like it is an environment to sort of fairly low autonomy. How much of that is kind of, real?
I don't want to speak with any real knowledge about training now, because it's more than 2 decades since I was in training myself. What I would say in relation to portrayals in the media, films like Billy Elliot, fantastic film. I have to say, not too far from my experience at all. I didn't feel when I saw that it was exaggerated for dramatic effect necessarily. That resonated as being quite accurate for me. I suspect that they did some very, very good research on my particular training environment, to be honest. I do think things have changed, which is, of course, progress. It's described only as progress. I think we are probably some way behind other high performance training environments in a lot of areas. I do appreciate that there's progress in the psychological content of what dance students are educated with now, but clearly there's really some way to go, and that holistic approach is broadening and encompassing more facets of or equipping students with more skills and tools for the career that they're actually going to have. I think one of the ways of looking at it perhaps is that in my generation we were trained as if we were going to be top star principal dancers. That was very much the focus, and also in that era very much geared towards being in a Royal Ballet Company, whether that's at Covent Garden in London or in Birmingham. Now I think they accept a lot more that in the Royal Ballet School, for example, their students may not even be ballet dancers necessarily. And that's also reflected in the fact that nobody in a ballet company now is only a ballet dancer. The kind of styles that we're required to dance is much more varied, I think, across the ballet world than it necessarily was in the past. But also in the training environment, it's recognized that people might go off on a different route. And I think that's very healthy. But beyond that as well, there's also, I think, a recognition that although the remit of the school is to train dancers, and I'm talking here generally about the various vocational schools, although their remit is to train dancers, there's a recognition that actually employment rates aren't very high, and that their students need to be prepared for that, and they need to also be ready for the world outside of dance or in different related disciplines.
So it's quite interesting because, Sunny, you said you work with dance teachers as well. So what's your take on that, this idea of preparing perhaps these dancers, these athletes for a life that doesn't necessarily take them in that direction? Because again, we see that in sport, don't we? We see people fall out of sport at age sort of 16, 17, and because their identity is wrapped up in their athleticism, their athletic identity, all of a sudden everything's gone. Is there more work in preparing dancers for that, as Kit's talking about?
I want to say first that I meet a lot of fantastic people, including a lot of fantastic teachers who absolutely want the best for the dancers that they meet, and who read everything and go to CPD seminars, and who are so engaged and such lovely people. So that exists for sure. I think things have changed, along with society changing, albeit sort of slower. But I will also say that sometimes, because I sort of work with these issues on a daily basis, I will sort of, sometimes if we write things about, say, autonomy being thwarted or something, I go, is this really true anymore? And then another scandal breaks in the media. We've had so many scandals, just like in sport, but specifically in the dance and the ballet world, just in the last year, which are absolutely shocking and speak to all of the things that are, that you mentioned at the start, with regards to all kinds of abuse and really horrendous teaching methods. So then I sort of have a reality check and go, yeah, it does still exist. So I think it's just that everything coexists, but I believe in a general rate of progress for the average.
Upward trend, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's certainly, like what Kit was saying, in terms of a lot of recognition that there are many ways that a career can go. And because even classical dancers need to do contemporary work, yeah, I mean, I don't think any ballet school does not do contemporary classes, for example. So with regards to that, that certainly has moved in, and several schools, I don't know about many, and several companies, again, I don't know about many, but would have support like on the sides that's different to what it was a number of years ago. I mean, originally, of course, there were no health staff at all. And then the first thing that anyone would get would be one physio. And now, I mean, maybe Kit, you can comment on the range of staff that a company like yours would have for support.
I think it's important as well to make a distinction, first of all, that we are a relatively large company, and we're very well supported by the Arts Council. We're very grateful for that. Not so many companies have the kind of resources that we have. So there are challenges there. And it's not unusual to find a reasonable sized dance company that doesn't employ their own physiotherapist, for example. Now they would at least hopefully have a regular professional that they can coordinate and get their dancers seen quite quickly, but it may not be a member of staff for them. At Birmingham Royal Ballet, we have a dedicated facility where we employ 3 full-time physiotherapists. We have a clinical director, a massage therapist. We have access to Pilates and strength and conditioning. We don't employ a psychologist, but we would have access to, should that be deemed necessary. So as a kind of gateway to other disciplines that we don't have in-house, those things can be signposted there, which is very, very helpful. And the most brilliant practical aspect of that is that it's in the same building as our studio base. So if I have a break in the day, I can be in there doing some additional training, or having some massage or anything that I need. And a kind of byproduct of that, and something that I think we are quite good at in Birmingham, is the education side of that. So we've got dancers in there, and we can offer them workshops about sleep hygiene, for example, or nutrition, or we can provide that for the company, which I think is it's a real luxury to have that. And that feeds through into everybody's professional practice, and hopefully makes us better dancers, which at the end of the day is what it's all about. But if we can be healthier dancers physically and mentally, then we'll perform at a higher level. And I think a facility like we have there has a real opportunity to have a huge influence there, and to show dancers that it's so much more than what you do in the studio alone. That's obviously a huge part of it, but it's necessary to support that from other angles to really get the best out of your dancing.
The thing is, even though the BRB sort of health suite and everything, like, it is amazing, and obviously it's great that there is the signposting to additional services, I still think it's there's a real emphasis on physical aspects, like both for preventive and for remedial kind of work. So I guess as soon as the psych aspects are out of the house, the chances are that they're less seen, it's less obvious, it's less accessible, and perhaps the educational side that you said you were missing in your training are less likely to exist as well for that same reason. So yeah, this is sort of, it's very cool, but it's, yeah.
And it's interesting, I think, because I have an interest, I'm a psychology student, and many of my colleagues are aware of that I am able to identify an interest and a need for that kind of support. And what happens, and I'm in no way being critical of our healthcare team here, because it's not something that they're at fault for in any way. But I do have dancers coming to me to ask for psychological support, and I'm not able to offer that. I'm a student. I'm an undergrad student.
Yeah.
But all I can do is reinforce. Yeah, I think if this is something that you feel might help you, go and find someone. Talk to our clinical team, and get them to put you in touch with someone, because clearly you feel there's a benefit from it, and certainly if you feel there's a benefit, you will benefit from that. And then perhaps, I don't know how you feel about that, Sana, but perhaps that's the beginning of a bit of a cultural shift, where if you can get the people that have identified their own interest or need for support, you're getting closer to the people who maybe haven't self-identified as needing that support, and normalizing it. And of course, there's still stigmas around that. That's ongoing education needed. But perhaps then you can get closer to the people that perhaps don't realize that they could benefit.
Yeah. But I think it's important with what you say as well, that just like it's very different with let's teach dance students how to eat healthy and treating an eating disorder. Those are very different tasks, jobs, and problems. It is also very different to be like, oh, let's have strength and conditioning to prepare for the season ahead, and working with an existing injury. Like, we all see that those are different things. But sometimes with psychology, the stigma of, oh, I'm addressing a deep-seated psychological issue, like the fear of that sort of spreads into there not even being the preventive skill building. And that's like a huge task. And I mean, great that you can contribute in that regard, with regards to the answers that you give and the encouragement. Yeah.
What it does is it continually inspires me to go, this is an area that I really would like to get into, because I can see it, and I think I'm well placed to maybe understand the context that that dancers might be experiencing, the dance specific sides of any particular psychological need, and it does make me want to be able to provide some kind of support. So just going back to what we were saying about motivation, my motivation for studying psychology has never wavered, because I can see that there's a need for that.
This is 80% Mental, and I'm here with Kit Holder and Dr. Sana Nordin-Bates, and we're talking about the psychology of dance. If you are enjoying the conversation, don't forget you can listen to all of our other episodes and subscribe at 80percentmental.com. You can follow us on Twitter at EPM Podcast, or on Instagram at 80% Mental, all words. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Are you a dancer? Is psychology something that's important to you? What are some of your mental skills that you fall back on? I want to come back to something that you talked about earlier. I think both of you mentioned this as well. You talked about perfectionism in dance. And I wonder, what's the line, or is there even a line between perfectionism and sort of spilling over into obsession? And how do you walk that line? Kit, I'll come to you first as the dancer, and then Sana, I'll kind of get your perspective as the psychologist. What do we think about that?
I was really hoping that you would go to Sana on that one. And also, I should just drop in that my wife did her master's as a comparative study in elements of perfectionism between professional ballet dancers and elite gymnasts. Okay. So I feel very much the novice in this topic. I want to pick up on something Sana said earlier, that people they wear perfectionism as a badge of honor. And there's no kind of acknowledgement to the risks and the potential dangers of perfectionism there. Now, there's a difference, I think, between aspiring to perfection and realizing that perfection is not achievable. And yes, I think a lot of dancers do obsess over details that they would deem necessary for them to perceive their performance as perfect. And I can tell you that in 22 years of professional dance, I have never given a perfect performance, whether that's in the studio or in rehearsal. Never. So the measures by which I would determine whether a performance was good or if I was satisfied with it are more valuable to me than whether or not I hit this impossible threshold of being perfect. And those are much more things like, did I enjoy it? Did I stay on my feet rather than falling on my backside, which has happened, right? And perhaps the performances where I fell on my backside, in future, when I've no longer got the opportunity to dance like that anymore, they might be my favorite shows. Yeah. But the performances that I think are highlights and are my best performances, the ones where I felt I could say my performance was excellent, are very few, very, very few. And this is at a point in my career where I've danced over 3,000 performances. I'm at peace with that completely, because I feel like I have given everything that I can to those performances. I have paid attention to details. I have worked hard. In the later parts of my career, I've used the additional skills, the visualization and so on that I could apply. And I'm content that I've done everything. I'm also comfortable with my limitations. There are dancers whose physical attributes enable them to do things that I would never have been able to do. And I think part of it in dance is the aesthetic. People always want longer legs, differently shaped legs, more bendy feet, higher legs, a more bendy back, longer arms. The list is endless. And these are things that beyond, a little bit of training and technique are unachievable. Mm. And there's simply no point. If anything, if I was going to give practical advice to a dancer, it would be, okay, so your hip rotation limits your turnout. How are we going to deal with that? It is what it is. And within the boundaries of correct technique in dance, how can we get away with that? Acknowledge the limitation. I know professional ballerinas, so, extreme hip rotation turnout is desirable in dance. I know top ballerinas who just don't have even average. And you have no idea, because they're so smart in the way that they work, that you're even as an expert in dance, you don't spot that because you're so busy going, oh wow, their movement quality is incredible and their line is still fantastic, but dancers will obsess over that detail. And Sana, I'm going to hand over to you with the question with the prompt. Do dancers, in your experience, when you're looking at perfectionism, obsess over their limitations, their perceived limitations?
Completely. I mean, to varying extents, obviously, and I would say huge generalization, and based on the limits of my knowledge and exposure and so on, more women than men, more girls than boys. And I mean, seeing from a general population in general, unfortunately, girls and women have lower self-esteem, for example, than men and boys. So, and with certain forms of mental illness, it's higher in women and girls than in men and boys. So it might be related to that, more underlying kind of vulnerabilities. But I think for ballet, there is also much more competition among girls because there are more of them in training. So boys get away with more, right? They feel more valued sometimes because they might be the only one or one of only a handful in their class. So like they get the solos, or they get things kind of shaped a bit more after them, because you do need a prince, right? We might have 16 princesses, but we only have one prince, so let's look after him. So I think that contributes as well, because of that kind of increased competition, and the demands then sort of become higher. But intriguingly, I don't know anyone who would go to a ballet performance and go, wow, the women are so much better than the men. Right? No one would go, oh, ballet would be better if the men were out there crap compared to the girls.
Yeah.
So we still see like amazing skills and amazing artistry, both from men and women. So what was the point of all that competition and extra pressure? I don't think that it does us any good, really. Comparison really does, right? So yeah, that was sort of one angle of it. In terms of your question, Pete, in terms of obsessing, yes, there is an overlap, even with OCD symptoms occasionally, when it goes sort of too far. To what extent that's personality and what the person is like, and therefore they were attracted to and stayed with ballet, and to what extent it's kind of reinforced and taught in the environment, I guess we'll never know, right? Probably a bit of both. Certainly people who are super laid back and sloppy often don't get recommended, like, oh, you'd really suit ballet, you should really go there. So there is a certain amount of self-selection sometimes, but also like what parents put their kids into because they think it suits them. So with that would speak to a personality aspect perhaps, but in an environment that reinforces never being pleased, or that it could always be better, or that you must polish and you must do this thing 32 times in a row, I think it's reinforced as well, sometimes to people's detriment. So I think the people who are somewhat perfectionistic or just want to strive for excellence, actually in quite a healthy way, they can manage to do it well if they can get that kind of zoomed out view, not get too enmeshed in everything. So like the critique is not of me as a person. It's actually just how I did that turn. Can I be fine with like, oh, he just said that. Okay, I'll just work on my turns, rather than really swallow it in and feel inadequate. That makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
To whether the person's even able to like go home and have a nice evening off, and be able to kind of sleep properly and, you know, come back with more energy tomorrow. So.
Yeah, and it's tough, isn't it? Because we have that sort of innate negativity bias anyway, don't we? So in an environment where you're essentially constantly being critiqued, that's going to hit hard, I suppose.
Yeah, completely. And especially if then there's some sort of ideal that is what it takes. And I think it probably is what it takes to work hard and to want to work hard. But I don't think that being dissatisfied is a great driving force, really. Like, I mean, ideally, you'd be pleased with the show and then be like, oh, but I'd still like to make it a bit better. Or I wonder how I could add this extra aspect. How far could I go? So that it's actually like an intrinsic motivation and a curiosity that kind of drives the next day, rather than at least I'm not as bad as yesterday or something. Yeah.
A thoughtful criticism rather than just a criticism, right? So we're kind of veering in this direction anyway. What sort of things might go into preparing a dancer then? As a psychologist working in this field, what sort of things would go into preparing a dancer for the rigors of training and for performance as well?
I think you can answer that in two different ways, more and less flattering towards the dance community.
Okay.
Because you could say kind of nothing, right? If they're not getting any psychological skills training, etc. They just... just go to class and hope for the best. But on the other hand, I don't think we should we should recognize that there's a lot of psychological aspects in any training. The language that a teacher is using, I mean, just as a baseline, is it kind? Is it clear? Is it helpful? I mean, that's going to boost a dancer psychologically, even if no one has any psychological training or awareness, right? Like, a physio after an injury would probably work with a goal setting program. That's going to help the dancer if they are good at doing that. They may not call that a psychological skill. They might just call it planning, right? So I think there is a lot of good stuff that goes on, but we don't label it psychology. Otherwise, in the more sort of explicit, typical sports psych way, obviously Kit's given some examples of imagery in terms of going through things for learning, for memorizing, and for other aspects. A key thing that I keep coming back to is the importance of focusing on yourself. So like a task orientation or a process focus over how high is her leg, or what does he think of me, or what's the outcome going to be. So to actually really know what is my constructive focus in this moment. And it could just be a correction or an instruction from a teacher, but more often than not, I find that it's artistic. So I'm going to pass that ball to you in a second there, Kit, but especially for the perfectionistic dancers and those who get very caught up in negativity or a sort of limitations, it's often about technique. But if they can learn to kind of get immersed and get help from a teacher or a choreographer or just from the piece itself to kind of go, actually, what I want to do with this is express that emotion or point in this direction, and all my attention can go into that artistic aim, then I can lose myself a little bit and really kind of be lost in the work, and usually all for the better.
I 100% agree that a lot of the stress for a dancer comes from that comparing to other people, comparing to your colleagues, and I think there's this ideal that's perpetuated in the corps de ballet that everyone needs to look identical. They need to now, obviously, you need to do the correct choreography with the correct timing with the music and the correct position on the stage and all of this, but it does lead to us going, as you said, oh, that dancer's leg is higher than mine, their foot is pointed better than mine, they're jumping higher than me, or all of those things. And it's hard, I think, to break away from that, but maintain the skill of being perfectly in sync as a group of dancers, because it's built into it that we stand in front of a mirror, usually on at least two sides of the studio, all day, and we use that to compare and to judge ourselves all day, and that's in conjunction with having somebody sat at the front of the studio telling you what you're not doing right or what you're not doing well enough. And if you're lucky in the place that you're dancing, that person or people will also be telling you what you're doing well. But to make progress, we have to identify the things that aren't there yet. So we're getting it from all angles as dancers, and it's only usually when you're a little bit further into your career, and you're progressing through those ranks, maybe, and you're being given the opportunity to dance solo roles where you have the opportunity to maybe make those small adjustments, hopefully maintaining choreographic integrity, but where you can make those small adjustments just to accommodate your abilities or the areas where you're perhaps less capable in certain things. But it is a challenge, and especially I think for young dancers that are finding their way in their career, to accept that they're just not going to do those things as well as somebody else, and they're going to have to stand next to them and do it.
I also don't know if we have any research on it yet. There's probably some in like other domains, but the comparison that's become possible via social media apps and videos in the last few years, I mean, it must just be exaggerating it so many times, because before, you were comparing to the people in your studio, right? You had some hope then. And then maybe if you move to more advanced classes, levels, cities, whatever, then, maybe the comparison kind of got harsher, but still relatively small pond, right? When you're suddenly comparing to the rest of the world, and maybe even in enhanced videos that are really kind of cut down, I don't know what it's doing to people, but it's not looking pretty.
It's a problem. I really think it's a huge problem, because it's an edited view, and it's a snapshot, and it's somebody doing, let's say someone's doing 15 pirouettes. Great. Now, it's quite common now that people genuinely can do that, but you're not seeing all the times where it didn't work, right? Where they didn't finish it nicely and make it look easy. And that's the same for any trick. You're not seeing beyond that, and more importantly, can this person convincingly play the role of a prince or a beggar or whatever? Can they do that? Or can they just turn lots and it's really nice? Can they do anything else? Can this person jump? Can this person work with another dancer and partner them beautifully and safely? There's so much more to a dancer, and it also it extends to all aspects of dance. You'll have people posting teaching videos with a bit of advice, and that advice might be really good, sound, helpful advice. But beyond that, are they a good teacher because of that? Can they actually sustain a class and train their students proficiently and healthily? Who knows? But people are building reputations and are attracting employment opportunities based on a profile that's built through social media. And the risk, of course, is that they can't back it up. And I find that problematic. And the flip side of that is that the kind of business savvy people in the dance know that these people have thousands or even millions of followers. And if you can get them on your stage, you're going to attract an audience. And I, of course, I'm not going to name names, but we've seen that. We've seen that in the dance world where somebody will do a guest performance because they've got, however many followers on Instagram. And it's not as good as you might have been led to believe necessarily. But they sold a load of tickets, so who knows?
So what are your sort of go-to mental strategies, skills? You mentioned imagery a little bit earlier on, Kit. What are the things that you sort of routinely fall back on?
I have one of the things, probably the single most valuable thing that I've taken for my own professional practice is breathing techniques, actually. It's less common now that I have really pronounced somatic anxiety, but that's the thing that I find that we're all going to get that kind of nervousness and performance anxiety, whether that's in a rehearsal or a performance environment, and I think we're getting better at acknowledging that is necessary to some extent, but it's certainly normal. And it was one of the things that interested me actually about getting into studying psychology in the first place, was just observing how different dancers appeared to be managing that before a performance. Some people would kind of shut themselves off and they'd have that face that just kind of says, don't talk to me, getting in the zone. And they'll be on stage, in a corner going through their choreography or warming up with their headphones on, whereas other people would be laughing and joking around the stage, and maybe that was their way of sort of distracting from it. But I thought, I recognize that there's lots of different ways. And I had tried lots of different ways. If I was laughing and joking around on the stage for a role that was important and high pressure enough for me to feel that anxiety, I didn't feel that helped me. I've also tried, having a playlist of music to pump me up, and that didn't work. That made things worse for me, actually, because it just added to this sense of occasion and this sense, this is something big. But I found that the breathing techniques for me not only addressed those physical symptoms, but also acknowledged that this was a big deal for me in a helpful way, that I felt that was a constructive thing, and I was able to focus, to really get my brain in gear and to concentrate on what I needed to do. I felt that it was physically facilitative to use those breathing strategies, as well as helping to address the kind of butterfly stomach and heart rate and so on. That's just been huge for me, and it's one of my frustrations that I could have had that much earlier on in my career, And actually, in fairness, I should name check and acknowledge my mum here, who very early on, if I was doing a dance exam or something, as long as I can remember, would I don't know whether I would say, oh, I'm nervous, I'm terrified, I don't want to do it, or whatever. She would identify that, and she has always said to me, 3 deep breaths and a quick pray. So that's actually been there from the beginning, but I think that I never really brought that across into professional life. I think that was more like a home life thing. And I should have listened to my mum. That's kind of the takeaway from that. She was right all along. Amongst all the skills and tools, that's the one that I think I've really found useful and regretted not employing earlier.
Yeah, shout out to the mums out there and the dads, because I used to get pep talks before doing exams or driving test or anything like that. I would always have a pep talk. It was kind of tradition. So yeah, shout out to the parents out there. Okay, so this is 80% Mental, and I'm here with Dr. Sanna Nordin-Bates, Associate Professor of Sports Psychology, and Kit Holder, first soloist with the Royal Ballet Birmingham. And we've had such an intriguing discussion around the psychology of dance, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I have a couple of more questions before we wrap things up, though. I'm really interested, Kit, in the creative elements of dance, and it might be that I amend this question slightly based on what we talked about a little bit earlier on with kind of the sort of low autonomy environment. But sport in a lot of ways is very much constrained by rules, really specific rules. I guess perhaps in some of the more aesthetic sports like diving, like gymnastics and such, maybe there's perhaps more creativity allowed, but it's still within a real sort of constrained set of rules. And I wonder, does dance allow more creative expression? And I guess it's more than just what's the motivation. It's what is it that you're expressing? What is it that you're expressing? What does that expression really allow in dance? That's kind of a real sort of deep, complicated question. I don't know how you want to take that.
So I'm quite fortunate that during my career I've been on both sides of creations where I've worked with choreographers and trying to get to what it is that they're driving at and what they want to happen on the stage, what they want to express and convey. And I've created my own work. So I'm quite lucky that I can speak from both sides of that a little bit. One of the things that I found very, very interesting is when you're working in narrative work and you're telling a particular story. So, for example, about 12 years ago or so, we created a new production of Cinderella. Now everybody knows the story of Cinderella, and the choreographer was Sir David Bentley, who's renowned for being fantastic at creating narrative work particularly. So that was a question of getting inside his vision of how is this prince going to behave? How are the Ugly Sisters going to be? What actually are their characters? Are they comedic? Are they really outright nasty? I think initially my role in that was a frog, and I had a huge, you couldn't see my face at all, I had a huge like beach ball sized frog head. So the challenge there is, well, without the face, how do you, and the costume was quite big as well, it has to be said. So how do I use my movement to do anything actually, first of all, but then what is that? Is that funny? Is that cute? And what's the role within the narrative? So the process in the studio for those kind of things has always been, okay, well, what's the audience going to take away, and how do we show that consistently? And then by extension of that, we, with most of the shows that we do, will tour those shows for weeks on end, different venues. So most roles will be performed by different dancers. There'll be 2 or 3 different rotations of cast, and there has to be consistency across those. Now, as a dancer, I've found that the most rewarding aspect of performing is where do you add your individuality to that, but still do all the required things of telling the story and the technical side of it. but maintaining that consistency across casting. If the show is not a narrative show and there's not a story to tell, you don't have a character with a defined set of characteristics and personality to convey, that's often more interesting. And that abstract side is, for me, one of the most beautiful things that you can get in ballet, because there's something that's really hard to put your finger on. Why does it move an audience? Why does it captivate an audience? Or not, it has to be said. Why is an audience left cold by this particular thing? Because you can have dancers on stage doing the most amazing things physically, but if there isn't an emotional response in the audience as well, it doesn't sustain their attention for very long. I think then they can go and watch sport or go and watch gymnastics, where people are doing equally, if not more, incredible things with their body. It's the emotional content and communication and expression that sustains dance as an art form. And if somebody could answer how that happens and how you do that, I'd be very pleased to know their answer, because it would make a lot of people's jobs much easier. And it's also subjective. What one person in the audience finds beautiful and stunning and incredibly moving will leave another person entirely cold. And that's nothing necessarily to do with their familiarity with the requirements or knowledge of dance. It's just human nature. It's just subjective. So that, for me, I think is the goal. That's the endeavor that we all have, is to really emotionally connect with an audience, whether you're the person that's trying to choreograph it or perform it.
Sana, just come to you for a second. Working as a psychologist in dance, working with dancers, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned as a psychologist?
I mean, linking in a bit with the theme that Kit was speaking on most recently, so creativity and what makes art, good art, or engaging for both the performer and the audience. I think I've learned a lot over the years. I don't think I knew hardly anything about it when I started out. And in learning more about it, I find that it's both possible to be more effective, perhaps as a consultant or as a teacher towards dancers, so that dance psychology is slightly different to sports psychology in that way. And I think it's also, it links together a number of themes like flow and absorption. That possibility to be really immersed in an experience is obviously part of where we want to go with creative work. Links with intrinsic motivation, and that makes it all the more important to strengthen intrinsic motivation, which makes it all the more problematic when environments are low in autonomy support, because we need that to support the motivation and the creativity and so on. And it links in with that attentional focus aspect that I said earlier on. So while like a task orientation in sport, for example, might be focus on you and your technical performance or your interaction with your teammates or something like that, it could in dance be that projecting or communicating or imagining or something like that. And I think that's been a real journey and really fascinating. And I guess, as with many things, the more you learn, the more things hang together. Which means that if people have a question or perhaps a problem, it may be that, but it may also be something underpinning it. So let's say someone is very anxious, for example. It's not necessarily that we need to work with anxiety reducing strategies, because it might just be a symptom of something else. Like maybe it is their perfectionism that we need to work with. Maybe they actually just need to change environment because it's frankly not healthy for them. And then there is no problem anymore. Or like there might be a CBT / mindfulness approach that again links in with what Kit said about breathing techniques earlier on, that only when I properly got into those literatures and practices did I see actually, we don't always need to reduce anxiety. I think certainly from my early sports psych learning, those books were often about, okay, anxiety is a problem, athletes don't really want it, how can we reduce it, by and large, with a few exceptions like psyching up for power sport, for example. But now, like, I start, even when I see 12-year-old dancers, to sort of talk about why do we have anxiety in the body and how it's a universal human thing. And okay, so the jury, are they saber-toothed tigers, or are they, teetering on the top of Mount Everest? Why do we have the same experience? To really normalize it and make them see, like, this is going to happen. And to say, do you know what do you feel when you're going on a really big roller coaster? Or when you're going into the haunted house or watching that scary movie? Or why do dancers put themselves on stage or in dance assessments when they know they're going to be anxious? Well, because it's an excitement reaction as well, right? It makes you feel more alive and on edge, and it's a little bit unknown, and that's amazing. So they're part of the same thing. So there, I think learning more tools than perhaps traditional sports psych, so CBT, but also mindfulness, has been enormously helpful, and really nicely compatible with dance practice, and also with more somatic approaches that are common in dance, not least contemporary dance, with regards to mindfulness, being in the moment, and breathing, and so on.
No,
I'm not sure that answered your question.
No, absolutely. Well, it answered that question.
It's a long meander.
No, if we, for anybody who's listening who's interested in that sort of thing, I did an episode back in series 1 with Dr. Josephine Perry and Joe Davies about anxiety, and about exactly some of the things you were talking about how it's perhaps not necessarily a case of having to reduce or get rid of or run away from anxiety. Can we just embrace it as kind of part of the journey, in exactly the way that you just so eloquently described? Kit, I want to come to you for the final question. And I'm trying to ask this of all of the performer guests on this series. And if you reflect back on your career, said in the introduction you had a 20 plus year career as a professional dancer. What would you say you've learned about yourself over the years?
How do I keep that clean for radio?
Well, I mean, there's no watershed here. You can say what you want.
I think this is probably going to pull together lots of things that we've spoken about. I can obsess about whatever it is that I am working on at that particular time, whether that's a particular role, or if I'm choreographing a piece, or if it's something that's not work. I play with the band, for example, so I obsess about that quite a lot as well. And the positive side of that is, I get stuff done, and I'm quite productive. I've also learned that bizarrely, alongside that, I'm a huge procrastinator, and most of my productivity comes from being productive in something to put off doing something else. So, so I find this a lot with my studies right now. I've gone back into another block of statistics, and right now my house is very, very clean. I'm very on top of the bass parts that I have to play with the band. I've even done some Christmas shopping, but I'm somewhat behind on my statistics.
For the listeners, we're recording this in very early September, just for context.
So I've learned about myself that I will get stuff done, but I could perhaps prioritize the things that need to be done a little better. However, what I would say is that I do get them done. I was going this year to not study. I was going to take a year out because there's just been a lot going on the past couple of years, professionally and personally. We've had a new director. of our company, which is great, but it has precipitated a lot of change in the organization. I'm also at the point where I'm accelerating towards career transition, and that adds a lot to my plate. It's not enough for me to just turn up at work and do my job anymore. There's a lot of supplementary stuff, not least this degree that I'm working on. So the need for me to prioritize has really come a lot more to the forefront in a way that I've never had to before. So I'm learning that. I'm also learning. This is turning into a little bit of therapy for me. I apologize for that. I'm also learning that in dance terms, I'm kind of old. I turned 40 this year, and I think it's really important to learn this perhaps a little bit earlier in your career than that. That as a physical performer, what you do after is going to be a longer, hopefully a job or employment, but it's going to be a longer part of your life. So I've been a dancer for 22 years. My next career, assuming I'm going to retire well past 65, as seems to be the pattern, is going to be a much bigger part of my life. And it's really interesting when you're looking at transition like that most, and I think this is common across most physical performance disciplines, that you will have trained really intensely for kind of 10 years or so before you get into that. Maybe some things, gymnastics maybe is slightly earlier, and other sports maybe you peak slightly later, but you've trained for 10 years for probably a 15 to 20 year career, and then you expect to go into another career afterwards, which is longer, and you perhaps haven't trained for that kind of similar period. And I think it's something that we're constantly trying to encourage dancers to do, that post-career planning. I did my choreography masters, which was great, and it's really helped my career. But a lot of that, the actual skills and so on, are less transferable. Having a master's is wonderful, and it's illustrative of capability and so on. But I find that the stuff that I'm getting at in psychology is much more transferable, and I've learned that process of learning and of self-development, professional development, self-improvement, and is not going to end. It's not going to stop. I'm not going to get there and then, cool, that's what I'm going to do every day now. It's going to keep going. Is there anything, I could talk for ages about what I've learned. Is there anything specific you'd like me to, an area?
No, I wasn't after anything. I was just curious. That's all.
I've learned that I'm still learning, and I think I'm always going to. And a lot of the stuff that I've learned, I'm later going to learn is wrong or has changed or needs to change, I think.
Well, I think that's probably as good a place as any to wrap things up for today. So I just want to really thank you both tremendously for the amount of time that you've given up to come on the podcast. I really genuinely appreciate it. Where can people find you if they want to reach out to you? So, Sanna, where can people get a hold of you?
Easiest on Twitter, so that's at DancePsychSanna.
Okay, awesome. And I can't let you go without at least a little plug for your new book.
Thank you. Yeah, so Essentials of Dance Psychology came out on Human Kinetics as an ebook about a month ago, and comes out in paper form at the end of October. Okay,
so we'll put links to your details and to the book in the episode description. But thank you very much for coming on 80% Mental.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
And Kit, same thing. Where can people get a hold of you if they want to reach out or find out more about you?
I am on Twitter. I'm not a prolific tweeter, but I'm there at Kit Holder. And I hope to continue working with Birmingham Royal Ballet. So we have a website, brb.org.uk, where you can find out everything about the company and touring dates, performances, which shows we're doing.
Okay, fantastic. Well, again, we'll put those details in the episode description. And once again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed this episode and the conversation with Dr. Sanna Nordin Bates and Kit Holder on the psychology of dance. We covered a huge range of topics, from the environment that dancers find themselves in training and in performance preparation. We talked about some of the mental challenges of dance, the threat of injury, recovery from injury, and re-injury anxiety. We talked about perfectionism and finding perhaps other criteria for judging performance, and treading that fine line between perfectionism and perhaps obsession. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope that you took something from it too. Don't forget you can leave a comment if you want to on the website 80percentmental.com, where you can listen to all the other episodes that are available and subscribe to the podcast if you want to. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter at EPM Podcast or on Instagram at 80percentmental. Mental. And don't forget to like, share, retweet, all that good social media stuff. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Although I won't see you because it's a podcast.